Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. In today's episode, I am going to be talking to Michael Gast. He is currently working on a multimedia project called Organize the Rich. And he is someone who has been organizing rich people, both himself and others, for 22 years. Michael is the former director of Resource Generation, where he spent 13 years organizing young people with wealth towards the equitable distribution of land, wealth, and power. In 2014, he transitioned off of RG and worked as a development director, fundraising consultant, donor educator, organizer, and advisor with groups like Movement Voter Project, Chinese Progressive Association, Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURGE, Thousand Currents, Generative Somatics, Climate Justice Alliance, East Bay Community Foundation, Justice Funders, and more. He is someone who has a plethora of knowledge, experience, also mistakes, which are also learnings. And I feel really grateful to get to share this conversation with you all. Welcome to the show, Michael Gast. I am so excited to have you here. Your work was one of the things that inspired me to start this show, just like sharing models, sharing frameworks. So I'm really excited to get more into it and hear more about your work and how you came into it. But as I do with all of my guests, I would love for you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your money story, as much or as little as you'd like to share, to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. My money story. What will I share today? Well, I was born and raised in San Francisco, California, and grew up going to fancy private schools and having my life subsidized by the wealth from my grandma on my dad's side. And she was widowed twice. She was married 3 times. And the last person she was married to was the chief counsel head lawyer, basically, for Hess Oil, which is a multinational oil company on the East Coast. And basically that grandfather had grown up with the Hess family, Leon Hess, in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. There's a rags to riches story of the grandfather peddling oil on the streets of Perth Amboy. And then suddenly, a few generations later, there's a multinational oil company. And so when he died, there was a lifetime pension for my grandma. She inherited money. And so she had a trust fund basically through these men that she was married to, all Jewish businessmen that died young of stress and different things. And then my dad had a trust fund to go to Stanford and to set up his architecture business and to buy a house with my mom and to send us to private school, me and my 2 siblings. And so I grew up feeling very middle class, but it was comparing myself up to people in my school that had a lot more. There was the great-grandson of William Randolph Hearst. There was people who had elevators in their houses. And so in that context, I was like, oh, I don't have that much. But it was in this little bubble of wealthy San Francisco. On my dad's side, it's sort of upwardly mobile Jews from the East Coast, Ashkenazi, who had come from Lithuania. And were business people and made money in different industries, sort of the well-paid professionals, both the well-paid professionals who work for wealthier people and some folks that were property owners and business owners. And then on my mom's side, she's 4th generation San Franciscan, Irish, Italian, and English, Protestant and Catholic. And there's also a bunch of wealthy folks. She grew up wealthy in San Francisco, in the neighborhood called Pacific Heights, which is a wealthy neighborhood there. Her dad was a stockbroker who had left his family on the East Coast, who owned this distribution company called Park and Tilford Grocery. And that part of the family had enough money that people mainly didn't have to work. They enslaved Africans many generations back. And by the time he got to San Francisco, he was sort of running away from a bunch of heartbreak and heartache on the East Coast. Him and his wife, my grandma, were alcoholics. And so he lost all of his money during my mom's childhood. So my mom was raised owning class, but then lost all the money at some point, and so had the patterns of owning class entitlement and sort of that culture, but didn't have the money, and was actually quite relaxed about money because I think she survived losing it and being all right. But she then went to school secretly on scholarship from the age of like 12 on. But then she went to Stanford as well. My parents met at Stanford University and got married, and yeah, that's sort of the context of what I grew up in. I grew up in the Inner Sunset in San Francisco, one of these, I'm air quoting, middle class neighborhoods in San Francisco, but it's all very confusing in a place where it's one of the most expensive cities in the world. So I wasn't really politicized that, well, I come from like a nice liberal, progressive Bay Area white family. I remember door knocking for Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition with my mom when I was a young kid. And so there was some activism around me, and I went to Hebrew school and learned about tzedakah and social justice from my Jewish community. But it was also very sort of like silent about inequality and oppression, and had a very sort of like, let's all get along, kumbaya sort of attitude in the private schools I went to. But I was always fascinated by class and money. And I was always like looking around me, taking the bus to school, seeing homeless people on the street, seeing the big houses my friends lived in, and was very curious about what was really going on here and why was everybody pretending like they were middle class. And so in college, I went to Vassar College on a trust fund from my grandma. And she would drive up in her Mercedes to college with like a trunk full of groceries. And I would be both excited to see her and totally embarrassed by this Mercedes and this old lady bringing me all this stuff. So I'd want to get off campus really quickly. And was politicized in college, learned about the criminal justice system, learned about white supremacy. It was like, oh my God, this is wild. And found out about social justice movements and wanted to be a part of them, but didn't know what that meant as like a young white boy who grew up in wealthy San Francisco, and had professors basically tell me, work from your own experience, work in your own communities. But I was like, what the fuck does that mean? And so when I graduated college, I graduated with $50,000 left in my trust fund. And I was like, I'm fucking rich. Like an able-bodied white guy, like with $50,000 in a trust fund, like I'm loaded. And so did what a good white liberal kid does, which I did AmeriCorps in San Francisco. And I did environmental justice education in the poor Black and brown neighborhoods of Southeast San Francisco for a year after college. And towards the end of that, found this book called No More Prisons, which this guy, Billy Wimsett, wrote. And in it is a chapter called The Cool Rich Kids Movement. And it talks all about this world of sort of resource generation and cool rich kids conferences. And I was horrified by the idea of identifying as a young rich kid, but also really excited to get some space to talk about money and class in the context of the movements I wanted to be a part of and the values I have. And so I went to Making Money Make Change. I found out that my sister's best friend from high school was on the board, and I called her up and I was like, are these good folks? Should I go? She said yes. And so I went. And it continued to be mildly horrifying, but it also was super exciting. And I finally found people who wanted to organize me to take charge of the money in my life, to make a giving plan, to make a financial plan, and to organize other people like me, which was super exciting. And so at some point, I started to talk more openly about the trust fund that I have and the wealth that I come from. I asked my grandma how much she was worth, and she did a double take and looked at me and she said, are you really asking me? And I said, yeah, I want to know. I want to know for my future and to do financial planning. She said, well, I have probably about $3 million. And I was like, oh my God, which at the time it was sort of mind blowing that that's what the numbers were. And talked to my dad about his finances and made a giving plan and sent it to my dad. And he started doing giving based on it. And so that's some long-winded version of my story.
Ah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And there's like so many little threads that I want to pull on within that story.
Yeah.
And in particular, you mentioned like a good white liberal guy. It worked for AmeriCorps. And I think that is it's like a consistent trend of like, oh, I want to use the skills, the knowledge I have to be of service or be in the community in some way. And so usually it's like we, the people with privilege, in a way, infiltrate these other communities that have their own solutions and have their own needs. And I'm just curious, is there anything that you want to add to that or any learnings that came through that experience, or like when in that story you started to notice like, hey, my experience is quite different, and the grappling of like, why is that? If there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah. I mean, I think I went into it knowing that this was sort of a funny, funky thing to do, but that I wanted to do good in the world. I wanted to be a teacher at the time. I wanted to be connected to other young people who wanted to work in nonprofits and do good and do right and be part of social justice movements. And so it felt like a good opportunity to do that. But even as I was going in, like I said, I had teachers saying, work in your own communities and work from your own experience. But I had no idea what that looked like, and I had no models for how to do it. And so AmeriCorps was sort of the best I could figure out. And it was lovely. I still have friends from that time that are really different from me. I mean, probably one of my closest friends in the world is from that program, and she grew up in Hunters Point, and I grew up in the Inner Sunset, and she went to public schools, and I went to private schools, and they brought us together. And I'm so glad, and I have a few other friends that I still have from that period of my life. So I'm really glad I did that program, and it just speaks to the lack of options, even if for people who have these values of wanting to organize our people and work in our own communities. What does that mean? And so actually after that, I worked for a private school that was much more demographically like the private schools I went to. And part of the reason I did that was to try to work in my own communities. And it was an interesting experiment. It was fine. I enjoyed parts of it. Yeah, those are some of my reflections, both that I really am still glad that I did that program. I learned a ton. I could see how ignorant I was and how I wasn't the right person to go into these predominantly Black and brown schools and teach about environmental justice. It just didn't really make sense. And these young people and me and other people, we created real relationships, and it was great. So the structural setup wasn't ideal, and real good human things happened in spite of it. And I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad that did not turn into my career because it made no sense long term. I feel like there was always the joke of like Michelle Pfeiffer, Dangerous Minds, these movies back in the day of the white savior. And so I already knew sort of to critique the white savior thing, but work outside of it at the same time.
One of the stats that I've read, which granted I have not fact checked, but what I've heard is that one of the highest predictors of class ascension is having cross-class relationships, that having those social connections and social relationships makes it possible for people to kind of move up. Certainly is not the answer to collective liberation. And that was definitely true of my experience and as my family ascended classes too. And I'm curious to know a little bit more about, because I want to talk about Organize the Rich. So what was the journey from, you were a teacher, working in schools. Can you share a little bit about what Organize the Rich is? And then I have many more questions for you about that. But how did you go in that trajectory with your career?
Yeah. So spent 5 years doing all sorts of volunteer leadership roles within resource generation. I made a giving plan. I made a financial plan, started hosting local dinners. I went to their national conference, Making Money Make Change, and then went to their leadership development conference called the Donor Organizing Institute. I was really excited to be deputized as an organizer in my local community, and then ended up spending 5 years on staff at Resource Generation, became the family philanthropy organizer, then the co-director, then the associate director, and just learned so much. It's basically spent like a decade in this project with a multiracial cross-class leadership team, getting to do this experiment in how do we organize young, wealthy people towards social justice? What does this look like? What can we figure out? What can we borrow from more working class led community organizing efforts that will be relevant here? Learned so much, tried so much, loved it. Passed the baton when I was 34 because Resource Generation organizes folks 18 to 35. So I was on staff. I passed the baton. I stepped out of my leadership role. Ime Ho, who ended up becoming the executive director, took my position as the associate director, was very excited, waved goodbye, and ended up for about 5 to 10 years being a development consultant for a bunch of different organizations, being interim development director for groups like Showing Up for Racial Justice, Thousand Currents, Chinese Progressive Association, Generative Somatics, all these groups that I would work with, and was excited to figure out that what I learned at Resource Generation about fundraising actually really was applicable other places too. And then I had a child and was a stay-at-home dad for a couple of years. And then I came back into consulting, really more on the donor side, doing more donor advising and helping foundations do donor education and really more with the wealthy people directly rather than fundraising them, but sort of doing that one-on-one and small group support work and education work. And as I came back into this work after I had a kid, I found that a lot of what I was doing was sharing stories of what I'd learned about the lineage of these efforts and experiments and projects that had come before. And I was finding that a lot of people weren't aware of these stories and that there was a lot of people coming in feeling like with great new ideas, but didn't know that similar things had been tried before. And I just felt like ever since I got into this work through Resource Generation, I was waiting and wanting more accessible, open, honest sharing of the history of wealthy people's involvement in social justice movements. And it was really hard to find. I really had to be a sleuth and a detective and go after elders and ask them questions. And everybody was a little wary and a little hesitant to really share openly and honestly about how wealthy people have been involved in left movements and working class movements and social justice movements. And so after waiting a while for other people to start doing this project, I decided, with the support of some friends and colleagues, to start doing it myself and started Organize the Rich. And at first I thought it was going to be a book that I would write with actually Ime Ho. We decided we're going to write a book together about Resource Generation and about this work so that it's more accessible to more people. Soon after that, Ime got pregnant and had a child and also had a full-time job. And we were like, this isn't going to happen. This is not a reasonable task. And I realized also that I'm not someone that can go into a hole for 2 years and just come out and write a book and come out and be like, ta-da! And it was right before the 2020 election. I was like, this is not the moment I'm going to go away and write a book. This is the moment for me to stay engaged. And so instead, I started a Substack as a way to write a book out loud in public and build an audience and build a community and a conversation. And so that's how I started it, is for the first 6 months thinking it was going to be a book, first 9 months, first year, and then it turned into a Substack. And then at some point I was like, oh, the book's not even the point. The point is to get these stories out. So why don't I think about it as a multimedia project that's a podcast and an anthology and a Substack and an Instagram. And so just how do I get these stories out there more and more openly and accessibly so that we can build a bigger sense of the project we're in and make sure the project is framed not as a philanthropy project, but as a collective liberation project, as a movement building project, as a working class power building project.
Thank you. I'm loving the way that you're describing it. And the first time, I mean, if you're listening to this and you have not checked out Organize the Rich, I'll be linking to it in the show notes. But Mike also has a podcast, Movement Money, with Allison. Can you remind me, Allison?
Yeah, Allison Buchalov.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. And they are an incredible dynamic duo. And there's so many really moving stories and lessons. And it's like you said, like to uncover this anthology, there's so many things that we can take away and also incorporate into our work now. And I would love to take just maybe like one step back into the like, why do we even want to organize the rich? Because all the time, the slogans, the things out there,
are eat the rich. So I'm constantly hearing that phrase. I completely understand where it's coming from. And I think it can be very exclusionary and limiting. So I'm curious from your perspective, yeah, why do you think we should be organizing the rich? And how do you see that connected to the broader social justice movement strategy?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question. I love it. And there's a bunch of different reasons. I'll share a few. They're some of my favorites. I think we've tried this eat the rich strategy for a long time, and it's limited. I think working class led, poor people led liberation movements have had this question of what the fuck do we do with these rich people that are oppressing us for a really long time. I mean, class societies have been around for 4,000, 5,000 years, and we've tried killing rich people, replacing rich people, re-educating rich people, fundraising a certain set of rich people, and a lot of these strategies give us some short-term victories, and there have been really important victories that people's movements have had, including through guerrilla warfare and other ways, but they haven't really done what we needed to, and we're facing a moment as a human species where we need as many people as possible uniting together to make a new way, to get us through the many crises we face around climate, around democracy, around war and militarism, and find a new way. And being organized is a gift. Being organized is a way that we show our belief in people, and we show our belief in people's ability to work together and to transform systems and government and institutions to make things healthier for everybody. And I want everybody to be organized. And I think rich people can be organized. Rich people have always been part of social justice movements in different ways, individually and in small groups. And I think there's a powerful opportunity for us to organize a set of wealthy people to be on the side of working class multiracial movements that would be like jet fuel for that work. I mean, that we have more power and more ability to create the world that we need. So that's some of what the reason is. The other reason I just got to say is because the rich are already being organized every day by the right wing and by the dominant systems that tell us to hoard and protect and build bigger walls and have bigger guns, and that we are the job creators that deserve to have more than everybody else. And we're just going to work for a world where everybody tries to be more like us. And so we just have to be frank that rich people are already being organized. And so if we want something different, we have to provide it. We have to actually provide an interesting, compelling, accessible alternative for wealthy folks, or they're just going to continue to act as they do, or they're just going to be replaced by working class or middle class people that have done everything they can to fight tooth and nail to get into the owning class. And neither of these are good solutions. And so if we want an alternative to this sort of cutthroat class society that we have, we need to provide it, and we need to provide it for everybody, including the wealthy. I think it's just a really important part of this work that has already been happening. And so it's not that I'm actually arguing for something that hasn't been happening. I'm just arguing for us to notice it and think about it and talk about it out loud and reflect on what's going well and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially this concept of it's a gift to be organized. I think of it through the lens of my worldview, my perspective, like who I am as a person has transformed and changed, all for the better. I mean, I won't pretend that sometimes it doesn't get me down, sometimes the state of the world. And also it's like, wow, realizing my agency, realizing the power that I do have and the way that I can also bring other people in. It's a sense of purpose and meaning, and that perspective of like, I'm inviting you into something so special and that I care deeply about is not something to shy away from in these spaces. So I really appreciate you touching on that. You mentioned some of the hesitancy around sharing some of these stories as you started to collect the anthology and share these stories on Substack. When it comes to different power dynamics and cross-class coalitions, how do you think about like building trust across class, race, gender? There's many other like able-bodiedness. And I would be so curious to hear from you, like, what mistakes have you made? Because we always are making mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. If you had one learning to share, what would you want people to learn from your own mistakes?
I just have spent a lot of time trying to be the best rich person, and trying to be just the best, most down, most smartest, most relaxed, whatever the cool thing is to be, I want to be that. So I spent a lot of time trying to be better than every other rich person by sort of doing all these things, and it's not useful and it's not helpful and it's a total dead end. And I see so many of us falling into that, where without even meaning to, the world I grew up in was so competitive and very individualistic. And I had a running list, even as a kid, of like the pecking order of the boys in my class by who was the best athlete and who was good in school and who was popular and who wasn't. And I was trained up in that in a young age. So of course I brought that to the organizing and movement building and social justice work that I then engaged in as a young adult and a 20-something guy. Like that makes perfect sense, but it really has been an unhelpful way to orient to this work, and it's something that I've had to practice trying to do differently. Where instead of trying to be better than and separate than the other rich people around me, I've learned over the years to try to build relationships and try to build a team and try to build camaraderie. And when people make mistakes around me, I want to go towards them. And when I make mistakes, I want people to go towards me and be open about that. One time at Resource Generation, we were in this sort of cross-class relationship donor circle project, and one of my friends was speaking on a panel, and I was supposed to sit up front and be really supportive and be just a smiling face to support her to do this really hard thing. And I went up there with the best intentions and I sat in the front, and then I got uncomfortable. And by the things she said, by the dynamics of the room, by my own desire to be good and right, and I started to not make eye contact and to look away and to be uncomfortable and to be just fairly unsupportive. And it was shitty. It was shitty. My friend was up there trying her best to do this thing, talk about wealthy people organizing in this cross-class space. And I was squirming out of my seat, wanting to run away from everything that was happening and everything she was saying. And it was just an example of like, I couldn't at that point in my development, I was like 24, really show up for other wealthy people in those spots where there was some idea in my head that it would make me look bad. And so I think I've just had to work through a lot of that myself. And I think I have over the years, but any of those tendencies to try to be better than rather than being a part of a big team.
I definitely have my own stories of that too. I just remember when I was co-leading the Sunrise Movement Austin chapter, and it was a very cross-class container that we had. And I just remember thinking like, oh my gosh, if these people ever found out what neighborhood my parents live in, like I would never be able to be. Like I really tried to set myself apart and like not wear certain things to look a certain way. And yeah, that really resonates.
It's all a losing battle. We're not hiding anything from anybody. Everybody sees us for exactly who we are.
Honestly.
And it's been a struggle. And, I lose my integrity because I want to fit in. I remember I got in a really messy situation with a friend, one of my closest friends from college, South Asian man of color, and he was friends in the same sort of like lefty movement scene that I was. And I remember I met some cool lefty leader person who knew him, and I dropped his name and told some funny story about him that sort of like teased him in the story. And it was fucked up. It was like me trying to suck up to this person and show that I was like connected by sort of using my brown friend as like a chip in like, look, I'm connected to somebody. And then for me to tease him or tell some sort of embarrassing story about him to this person as a way to ingratiate myself. It was just all these ways that my own insecurities led me to lose my integrity and to do fucked up things to my friends. In service of me looking better. And it all didn't get us anywhere that we needed to go. But I do think that's some of the stuff that I've had to let go of, and just I think a lot of the storytelling, the money story practices, the practices of knowing my own goodness and knowing my own okayness outside of anything I do in this work, and anyway, really important for me to be able to then have honest relationships where I can own how awkward and insecure I am and have that be a basis of connection with people around me rather than how shiny and smart and just right I am.
Yeah. Were you able to have a repair
Yeah.
moment for that?
Yeah. I mean, it was totally painful. And oh, man, it was a lot. It was a lot. We had a hard time for a while as I worked through that stuff and he worked through his own stuff. But we're good. Yeah, we're good. We're dear friends.
That's wonderful. I'm really glad.
Me too.
And I think this connects to the next question that I want to ask you, but I'm curious to hear more about the major takeaways that you've had as you collect these stories, as you engage in the Organize the Rich multimedia project. And you describe it as, exploring the lineage of progressive and left efforts to organize the rich and what we've learned over the last 50 years. So I'm sure there's many, many lessons, but if you could just share a few major takeaways, what would you say they are? What lessons would you hope we pass along?
One is that we've always been part of liberation movements. Rich people have always, in individuals and small groups for thousands of years, tried and attempted to be part of people's movements. I think of fun examples like Anasuya Sarabhai in India in the 1880s, who grew up in a wealthy family that owned a bunch of textile mills, and she ended up helping form a labor union of textile workers and going to the negotiating table where her uncle sat on the other side and helping these workers get better contracts. And she's just like a radical, amazing feminist leader from that period. I think of the Mink Brigade, which is a bunch of wealthy, youngish women in New York who showed up on the strike lines and the picket lines of the garment workers in the Lower East Side in the 1910s and 1915s. This included the daughter of J.P. Morgan, and they would wear their minks and they would wear their pearls as a way to protect the workers from getting beat up by the Pinkertons and by the strikebreakers. And they used their social capital to rally support for the strikers and also paid for bailout funds, and generally were a great example of using their privilege to be able to build worker power. I think of Corliss Lamont, who was a stockbroker and in New York City, a wealthy, waspy guy, and he advocated for a bunch of janitors that were striking at NYU and Columbia, where he was working. He was one of the founders of the ACLU and just a really interesting and amazing guy. So there's all these individual examples that we can look at over the course of history that I think are really fun to look at. I always love talking about if we look at history through the lens of class, we can suddenly see rich kids pop up everywhere. We see Moses, this rich kid who was adopted into the Pharaoh's palace, found out about oppression, ended up killing a fellow Egyptian, running away, marrying somebody very different from him, pretending he was a working class goat herd for a long time, and then getting called back to face his adopted dad, leverage his privilege, and use it to help free his people. So there's just these ancient stories. There's Buddha, who is actually a prince, and in a classic rich kid move, goes off and renounces his worldly possessions and goes and lives on a mountain and wants to never be part of the. So I just feel like if we look at the history through class, we see over and over wealthy people wanting to do right and struggling with how to do it. And I think we can claim that history and look at it and say, this is nothing new. Every wealthy person who has that pang of we need to do something different, I shouldn't be hoarding all this, the system shouldn't look like this, is right. And we need to feed those flames by giving people more of these stories. So that's one.
Yeah.
And those are also my favorite stories.
I love I'm remembering some of them. Yeah. They're so amazing. I'm like, we need to keep talking about
They're
them.
so fun, and there's so many more. I think the other thing is that we really became organized in a new way in the 1970s. After the social movements of the 60s and the 70s. There was a bunch of wealthy people. I know the history from the United States. There's likely other histories in other places, but in the United States, we can see the seeds of a lot of the projects now, like Resource Generation or Solidaire or Women Donors Network, form up in the 70s, where there were groups with goofy names like Amalgamated Rich Folks, ARF, that came together and were the nascent sort of early versions of all the progressive rich people conferences that we've seen in the last 30 years. And we started to see wealthy people take on the identity of being organizers of their class. And that is a lot of what came together to create the funding exchange funds, which were these sets of funds in the 70s and 80s and 90s that had the radical idea of having people from the communities being funded get to decide where the money goes, and having rich people be the ones to fundraise that money to move to the activists and leaders in the mainly working class and communities of color that were getting funded. And so there was just a lot of exciting developments in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that we could study more and look at more and talk about more openly to be able to learn from them as we develop new models today. A few other things is just that the right wing has been working just as hard at this project as we have, and in some ways it's easier because it's lubricated by all of the dominant systems that are making sure that wealthy people stay rich and stay powerful. So neoliberalism has been this big project that has really dominated the US and the global economy over the past 30 to 50 years and led to the populist pushback that we've seen in both Obama and Trump and around the world. And that was funded by a bunch of rich kids too. They were just conservative rich kids. I think it's been really interesting to realize and look at the history and to look at the Koch brothers and the Scaife Foundation. They were actually young inheritors too. They never framed themselves as that. They were business owners or business stars, but they were not the people that started the wealth of their families. They just helped grow it and then helped move a bunch of it to a conservative right-wing Christian agenda of neoliberalism. So that's been interesting to learn about. Yeah, that's 3 of the lessons.
I love the 3. And I'm curious, as you think about the history and where do we need to go from here, because you also explore where we're at now and what might be next. Where do you see opportunities? Where, if you were starting to organize a group of rich kids, and you could impart your elder wisdom, what would you want to tell them? And what would you hope that they put their energy towards?
Yeah. Think a few things. One, I want all of us to claim this moment we're in where we have the largest movement ever that I've seen of owning class people siding with movements for justice, siding with working class, multiracial communities trying to find a different way out of this class system that we've created that's burning down our world. And it's wildly insufficient. And we're just beginning to scratch the surface. But I think what I would want any group of wealth holders that's interested in this work to do, whether they're rich kids or older elders and older wealthy people or new wealth or old wealth, is that there is an organizing model that we have and that we can learn from and that we've begun to figure out how to scale so that we can move from tens to hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. We're beginning to have that model. So learn from that model, get involved in places that are developing that model, and see what you can take from there. And then that we need to figure out how to expand beyond the margins. In the last 50 years, we've really brought together quite a Bad News Bears team of wealthy people. And it's often the young wealthy people, inheritors, queer people, Jews, rebellious young people, rebellious old people. It's wealthy people that have staked their ideas on being different wealthy people and outsider wealthy people. And we need to actually figure out how to go towards the center and how to get more straight wealthy people, get more normative wealthy people, get more men involved, get more folks that don't identify as anti-capitalist involved, and figure out ways to broaden that coalition while still having the politics of working class multiracial power building at the center. And that's a tricky thing to do. And I think it's going to take all of us trying a lot of different experiments to figure out how to both expand beyond the margins, go towards the center, but also keep a politics that is clear that redistribution is the way, and that we need to actually have a world without the inequality that we see right now, where resources are shared in a much more equitable way. And that means that everybody's lives are going to be better, including wealthy people's lives, if they are not allowed to have the amount of wealth that they have right now. So like how to do both of those things is quite a challenge, but I think something we're in a better spot to move towards now than we ever have been before.
I really appreciate you bringing that in. Folks listening probably already know this, but I have a background in tech. And so much of me wants to cast that aside. And I'm like, no. These are still my people. They are organizable, and we got to be the bridge builder and with boundaries. But bridge building, and yeah, we need more tech workers. We need people that aren't already deeply politicized, because otherwise, how are we ever going to have enough power to really make the changes that we want to see? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I really get excited about that. I think the building bigger coalitions with a strong rooted politics of the center really backs labor is sort of what I'm most excited about right now. And the other thing I want to say is that I do think we need to long term, for those of us who are a bit more experienced in this work, have been at it for a little bit, is prepare for victory and backlash. Every place, every country, every municipality, every state that has won redistributive policies, taxing the rich more, providing more of a social safety net, whether it's the New Deal or whether it's Chile with Salvador Allende or Cuba or other places, all these highly imperfect experiments in sharing resources have seen just a vicious backlash from the owning class, where we fucking will take you out and kill you and kill your kids and kill your grandkids if you come after our stuff. And so how do we actually have a team of people in the owning class to help hospice our communities out of these roles with love and care and kindness, and have our communities realize that it's not the death sentence that we feel like it might be to share these resources that we've stolen, I think is a huge task and not to be underestimated. And I want us thinking about that, even in this moment where we're getting our asses kicked, right? Like it's so visibly, the owning class is so visibly pillaging everything and breaking apart everything good for profit. Even in this moment where we're losing so badly, I think we have to imagine a moment in the next 50 years where we start winning. And what will that look like to actually love up our people in that and be ready to help them out so that the backlash is not as successful as it's been in the past?
That's even a like little microcosm of that example. So I live in Austin, Texas, and we voted in 2021 to defund our police department. And as a backlash and retaliation, our governor passed a state law that we cannot defund the police. No municipality can defund the police. Like the budget stays the same or it goes up. And so we've been fighting back against that every single year. Our budget season just passed in July. And it's something that I'm like, wow, this is something to learn from, and something that I hope listeners in other municipalities learn from and think about what are other forms of community safety, because we could be doing community defense at the same time.
So, I mean, Ludovic Blaine from the California Donor Table said this to me last year, and it stuck with me, is we, being sort of progressive liberal philanthropy or donors, are often very excited about funding things when we lose, but don't fund things when we win. And we need to fund the wins just as much afterwards as we do the losses. Like we're better being the underdog than we are actually winning. And what do we do when we win to actually fund the types of experiments and defense work that's necessary to keep these wins happening? And that stuck with me and speaks to what you're saying.
Yeah, totally. Everyone wants to fund getting trans and queer people out of Texas, but nobody wanted to fund any services or arts or anything. So anyway, yes, in many multiple dimensions. And I also want to honor your time. So I'll leave you with one more question. which is to wrap us up. We talked about so many things, so many patterns and trends, and I just feel so grateful for you coming on this show. And so the last question I have is, if you had a magic wand, what do you wish listeners of the show already knew about?
I will use this as a chance to talk about this anthology. There's an Organize the Rich anthology that has brilliant writing from a bunch of people I highly respect on this subject that's coming out next month in September, which will probably be in the past by the time this comes out. I do think that's a good intro to this work that will have people like Winona LaDuke and Rajas Vinny Bensali and Nigel Charles and Leah Hunt Hendricks and Billy Wimsett and other people writing on these topics, including me and Marion Moore and Alex Tom, the 3 co-editors. So I do think that is going to be a nice introduction to all the things that I was just talking about. And then if you are wealthy, if you're a wealth holder, if you have more than you need, I do think there's a whole ecosystem of these groups that are doing quite a range of different things, from tax the rich organizing like Patriotic Millionaires to donor networks like Women Donors Network and Donors of Color Network and Resource Generation and Solidaire, to really important work around impact investing, to important work around businesses and supporting labor. So there's a whole ecosystem of this work. I have a worksheet called Welcome Home that will help you find your place in it. And I think there's others that have this place too, but find your way onto a team. None of us can do this on our own. None of us are as powerful individually as we are collectively. So I really just encourage people to find a political home and a community where they can be part of these experiments. And I think for folks who are poor, working, or middle class, I want you to know that this is happening, that some folks are earnestly trying to figure out how to organize the rich and do it in right relationship with people's movements. And for you to send wealthy folks that you get connected to this ecosystem, and for you to know that this exists, and to figure out what your right relationship is to it. That's not simple stuff. There's not enough resources for every organization out there. There's not enough money or support for so many projects that poor, working, and middle class folks are doing. So it's tricky to find a right relationship with this crew of folks that is sitting on so much money. But I encourage everybody to do their money story work, do their class work, so that we can try to build a bigger united front.
Yeah, thank you. And where can folks find the book if they want to purchase it or support it?
You can find it on the website of Moon Palace Bookstore, which is a bookstore owned by Angela and Jamie Schwazenettel. And Jamie Schwazenettel used to be a staff person at Resource Generation when I was coming up. He was one of my first mentors. And so that's a bookstore in Minneapolis that is selling this book. And you can find more about Organize the Rich at substack.organizetherich.com. And hopefully at some point by the time this podcast is launched, I'll have a website, which I'm planning to have soon, which will just be organizetherich.com, but I am not there yet. I have a link tree, which is mildly helpful, mildly unhelpful. So yeah, Google Organize the Rich, you'll find it. Here's the name of it. It's called Free the People to Free the Money to Free the People, an Organize the Rich anthology.
Love that. And all of this will be linked in the show notes for listeners. Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.